was 10 a.m. on Thursday, May 4th, 1865, 2 full years after the Emancipation Proclamation. In Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's body was being laid to rest. But in Athens, Union soldiers were searching for the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was later captured about 100 miles to the south in Irvington, allegedly wearing a dress to hide his identity? I mean, seriously, you can't make this stuff up. The presence of Union soldiers in Athens meant the Civil War was over for this town, and more importantly, it meant freedom for half of the population of Athens and Clark County. Nearly 5,000 black men and women celebrated their freedom on that day. They called it the Day of Jubilee. Not everyone was happy about the troops' arrival though. Right here on Millage Avenue, what is now the Carl Vinson Institute used to be the Lucy Cobb Institute. The students here were in terror when they saw soldiers in blue coats in their town and in front of their school. A student there, Annie White, wrote, "To our horror, the street in front of Lucy Cobb was full of blue coats. I will never forget my terror." White Athenians were terrified of what a world without slavery would mean for them. By the next morning, the flagpole of liberty had been cut down by people who couldn't let freedom ring even for a day. Some enslavers tried to protect their wealth by sending the people they had owned to places where emancipation was unenforced. Black Athenians also responded to their new freedom, each person or family deciding what to do next. Some people left immediately to look for family members who had been sold away from them. Others left in search of paid work or safety in numbers. Some just wanted to leave the area where they had been held captive to prove they could. But not everyone could travel. Some were too old, some too young. As Augustus Hull, whose family members were prominent slaveholders in Athens and Clark County, put it, the younger men left at once, while those with families remained. John Cole described his newfound freedom as that of the Big Oak. He was free, but he had no way to go anywhere. At first, people's decisions revolved around immediate concerns: food, safety, family, freedom. But in the months and years that followed, emancipated Athenians began to think about what they needed to make that freedom more than just words in a proclamation. Many clearly concluded that to make freedom mean something, they would need to own land, to be educated, and to participate in the political life of the city, state, and country, which would determine their future. Many thought surely those who had been forced to work the land for generations would retain some ownership. Surely they would own the houses they had built with their own hands. Some of the newly freed people attempted to purchase land from their former enslavers with saved or borrowed funds. Others waited for the United States Army to fulfill its promise to redistribute land confiscated from previous plantation owners. This was a promise famously made by U.S. General William T. Sherman when he reached Savannah, Georgia on his famous March to the Sea. Sherman issued Field Order 15, which ordered the Army to distribute roughly 400,000 acres of land that had been captured or abandoned to freed people. Congress had even created a bureau to oversee this distribution, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or the Freedmen's Bureau for short. News of the distribution of land in the Sea Islands of Georgia spread like weeds. The President, Andrew Johnson, and Congress soon walked their promise back. Even the land already distributed was restored to its former owners. In Athens, David Tilson, the Freedmen Bureau's assistant commissioner, announced to a group of black men and women gathered at the University of Georgia that there would be no 40 acres and a mule. Instead, emancipated slaves were ordered to sign year-long labor contracts. They didn't have to work for their former owners and they were supposed to get paid, but they weren't allowed to leave when the contract was enforced. This didn't sound much like freedom. What good was freedom if you were still required to work for white people and you couldn't quit if you were poorly treated? And in a state as rural as Georgia, true independence meant land you could call your own. Few free people had their own land. Like many poor white people, most had to farm other people's land as sharecroppers, paying their rent with a share of the crop. Okay, so that was a hard no for promised land. But what about education? Denied an education by law during slavery, black people were now determined to learn. Shortly after the war, when the university reopened, a group of black men demanded to be admitted. In response, a group of armed white students fired shots at them. The next year, black Athenians tried again, carrying weapons of their own. White authorities again refused to admit them. Black people would continue to work on the UGA campus, but they wouldn't attend school there for nearly a century. Determined to be educated, freed people set up informal schools wherever they could, in homes, churches, or even under trees. Eventually, the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern Charities helped build and run schools for black students and adults in Athens. The most famous of these schools was the Knox Institute, named after the Freedmen's Bureau agent Major John J. Knox. The Knox Institute was the only school in Athens that was almost entirely free for its students. White Athenians would have to wait years for that privilege. So there was some progress when it came to education. Political rights were more complicated. In 1867, 2 years after the U.S. Army's touchdown in Athens, Republicans in Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act, which allowed black men to vote. Here in Clark County, white citizens, most of them Democrats, were furious. Many white men boycotted the election, and as one white Republican put it, armed white men harassed every colored man who wanted to vote. Black men voted anyway, and in 1868, they elected Madison Davis and Alfred Richardson, both of whom had been enslaved, to the state legislature. On July 4th, Davis and Richardson went to Atlanta to take their seats in the legislature. But just 2 months later, Richardson's time in office was cut short when white legislators kicked out 30 of the 32 black members. Madison Davis was able to keep his seat because, although white legislators knew he had been enslaved, he was very light-skinned, and they couldn't say whether he was black under their own rules. When several hundred black and a few white people marched 25 miles to protest the expulsions, they were shot at in what became known as the Camilla Massacre. At least 15 people died, and many more were injured. It took over a year before Georgia's military governor ordered that Richardson and the other removed legislators had to be allowed to return to their seats. Despite constant attacks on their political and civil rights, black Athenians, who made up more than half of the voters in Clark County, had some political power. For example, black students weren't permitted to attend the University of Georgia, but they won local funds for the Knox Institute. And after helping an independent Democrat get elected in the 1880s, Madison Davis became Athens' first black postmaster. That was a really big deal at the time. Monroe B. Morton, who later served as postmaster, became one of the wealthiest black businessmen in Georgia. The quest for true emancipation for black Athenians extended long after that Thursday morning in 1865, when U.S. troops entered Athens, ending the war and bringing news of the end of slavery. Every step towards real freedom and equality was opposed by white supremacists who wanted nothing to change. Though given so little, emancipated Athenians were determined to carve out whatever freedom they could, and the fruit of their efforts exists all around us today.